Good afternoon. Welcome to you. My name is Alistair Mackay. I'm the Director of Reconciliation Initiatives. Thank you so much for showing up this afternoon for this webinar. This is part of a series of webinars that we've been working with HeartEdge on during the course of this year after a successful series last year. Let's begin, first of all, by just reminding ourselves of God's presence with us. So maybe find a comfortable upright position for yourself with your hands open. Take one or two deeper breaths, and then after a moment of quiet, I'll pray for us. Gracious and compassionate God, as we meet and discuss and share together this afternoon, draw us closer to your heart for the poor. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by four speakers this afternoon. So we'll invite them to introduce themselves. Andrew, let's start with you. We'll go around alphabetically by first name.
Excellent. I'm Andrew Grinnell. I live in Leeds. I'm involved in something called the Poverty Truth Commission in Leeds, which takes people with a direct experience of poverty and they work with city leaders to engage in the issues around poverty. So I do that and part of a wider network of commissions around the country, and also do a bit time thinking theologically about ethics and poverty a little bit more specifically. And so I guess I bring to this afternoon a kind of willingness to learn from one another, and a real sense that actually unless those who experience poverty themselves are engaged in shaping issues around it, then we might not actually get good outcomes that we want.
Great, fantastic, Andrew, and apologies to everyone that we know you've got a slightly dodgy connection, but we'll hopefully catch enough of everything you're sharing to get the main things. Delene, let's come to you.
Hi, I'm Delene Mark from the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. I work within the Anglican Church. We have an organization called Hope Africa, which is the social outreach program for the Anglican Church. We work with clergy, bishops and lay people, trying to create a deeper understanding of the challenges of poverty and how best the church should be responding. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Great, fantastic, Delene. Thanks so much for being with us. Lynne.
Hello, I'm Lynne Cullens. I'm Bishop of Barking in the Diocese of Chelmsford. I live in London. My episcopal area is enormously diverse. We have around, I understand, 170 nationalities across the area, and we have deep inequality. 60% of the parishes here are urban priority areas, and we also have people of significant wealth. I'm chair of the National Estate Churches Network, and I'm just in the process of taking over the chair of the Church of England's Estates Evangelism Task Group from Bishop Philip. Philip and I have worked for the last few years on that. Philip has spearheaded that work around estates evangelism and prioritising the poor within the Church of England's agenda, which we can never lose sight of, really. So my passion today is to see the church address issues of poverty in our country. But I think, first of all, the church needs to remove the log from its own eye on some of those issues of inequality and social justice. So that's why I'm here, I think.
Great, thank you, Lynne. And Philip.
Yes, it's Philip North, Bishop of Burnley, and introduction from Lynne that shows exactly why I'm delighted to hand the chair of ETG over to her. So I'm Bishop of Burnley, which is in Blackburn Diocese. I hasten to add that is not my garden. I live in Burnley. I'm out in the countryside here this morning. I cut my teeth really in urban ministry. I was ordained as a response to faith in the city many years ago, and have spent most of my ministry in inner city or outer estates areas. I live now in Burnley in East Lancashire, which is a kind of classic working class ex-mill town, red wall, Brexit seat, also has the highest inflation rate in the country. This is a kind of area that I think is going to be worst hit by the cost of living crisis, as we're already seeing in terms of the impact on our churches that offer community services and our CAP Debt Centre and so on. So sort of feeling in the midst of what's happening in the country up in Burnley.
Fantastic. Thank you, Philip. Well, delighted to have all four of you joining us this afternoon. So as you've already will have picked up, this webinar is an opportunity to discuss what part the church might play in better addressing poverty today. And this is a conversation which seems particularly pertinent amidst the huge cost of living crisis that we're facing in the UK, and I think globally. I'm seeing Delene nodding, this is not something unique to the UK. Alongside this, and as Lynne has kind of hinted at, is a picture of increasing inequality. The Equality Trust highlight that after positive progress made during the Second World War, or sort of following the Second World War, there's been a growing inequality in incomes in the UK since 1979. And in more recent years, the Trust report that there's been a dramatic increase in the share of income going to the top 10% of income earners, accompanied by a decline in the share going to the bottom 40% of income earners. And alongside this, and there's many figures, different figures I could quote, but one which has been really striking for me is that there are over 4 million children in poverty in the UK. That is over 30% of the country's children. So amidst the cost of living crisis and growing inequality and a rise in poverty, what is the response and the responsibility of the church? Well, this afternoon we're going to focus on three questions. First of all, what's the main legacy from the past that affects how the church engages with people in poverty? Secondly, how does the church need to change in order to seriously address poverty? And third, how do issues around poverty link to issues around class? So let's turn to our first question. So, we are wanting to get on to think about poverty today, but I think it's important and worth acknowledging something of the legacy of the past. The biblical witness in both the Old and New Testaments is that God has a deep concern for and offers good news for those who are poor. And by the poor, I'm thinking those who are economically and socially disadvantaged. However, over the centuries, the church has a somewhat checkered record of serving and being good news to the poor. And at times, the church has appeared to be more concerned with power, position, and wealth. So our first question is, what do you see as the main legacy from the past affecting how the church engages with the poor in society? Lynne, let's come to you first.
Thank you, Alistair. I think there are two key issues for me, neither of them legacy issues in any positive sense. The first would be colonialism and the consequent racism that's embedded in church structures and church culture. Others are far more able and qualified to speak on that issue than me, but I need to name it. The second is the issue of class. That often intersects with issues of race, of course. The church, particularly the Church of England, I think, is affected at every level by class discrimination, by class profiling, by middle class dominance. Work is underway. I've been involved in some of it. I think Philip has too. Work is underway and ongoing to reform processes and structures to address that. But there's still a long way to go. And a change in the overall culture of the church, we've got even further to go. I often feel as an image that I don't know whether you've ever driven a car whose wheels need rebalancing. And you can keep the car straight as long as you keep a firm grip on the steering wheel. As soon as you let it go, it veers off. And that kind of feels to me like we are in the church. We put in, initiatives, and we put in projects to look at increasing diversity, especially around class and race, and we're holding good. We're looking at a new course, but then as soon as we let go, we default to a white middle class position, and it feels like you're constantly having to pull the church back to where, in social justice terms, it absolutely should be. It shouldn't be veering off in that way, but it does unless checked. That's my experience anyway. I think the dominance of middle class culture, white middle class culture, affects the church's ability to be truly transformative in approaching issues of poverty. We can give out food, we can be incredibly generous, and we see that up and down the country, but we're far poorer at acting in ways that are truly transformative in low income communities and in society more generally, in fact, because what we need to give away is position and power. We need those who are working class and those with lived experience of financial hardship to be at every level of the church. We need to ensure leadership is held at grassroots wherever possible. We need to have good, fair and open systems of discernment at every level in our leadership, and we need training to be class informed. And I think we need to have those from low income communities engaged on their terms and not ours. It's not about inviting them in. Often I talk about this in terms of our training. We train curates, but we're meant to be about formation, not assimilation. Too often people from working class backgrounds feel that they have to conform to a middle class identity in order to be accepted within the church. There's a real lack of those with lived and first-hand experience of poverty in our senior leadership, and that means our decision-making is currently skewed and far less informed than it should be, or indeed could be, and stereotypes then persist. And class is a diversity factor in the church that is still largely unnamed. And I personally feel that addressing the church's issue with class is key to our ability to engage effectively with poorer communities' issues of poverty, and for us to act as channels of transformation.
Thank you, Lynne. And we will very much be picking up the question about class sort of in the sort of last third of the conversation. But yes, so the legacy of colonialism and issues around class, two things you're really wanting to flag up for us. Thank you. Andrew, let's come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Lynne. I kind of agree with a lot of that. I guess there are some bits that I'd want to celebrate that we bring to this, whether that's the, looking right back into history and seeing the Cappadocian famine and seeing how the church was the response in that environment, whether that's things from liberation theology, where the recognition that being alongside people who struggle against poverty is fundamental to what it means to follow Christ, whether that's actually about some of the work that somebody like William Temple did in helping to be part of setting the seedbed for the welfare state. So I think there are things that we want to celebrate, we don't want to lose sight of. But I think in addition to what Lynne's really helpfully pointed out, I think for me there's two addictions that we probably need to address. And this isn't necessarily more about the structures, but more about actually how we respond to issues of poverty. The first addiction is, I think we're sometimes addicted to solving immediate issues. So we read the Good Samaritan as such, that we're all called to be the Samaritan, when actually probably the story, as Augustine talks about, is that actually we're the people beaten up by the road, needing the help of the Samaritan. And I think sometimes we're addicted to just solving those immediate issues that present themselves and not asking deeper structural issues. Some of the questions and the issues that Lynne raised, I would suggest that. I think the second addiction is that actually we often read the verse about being the voice for the voiceless, and we use that kind of as a mantra without necessarily asking whether the people in question are voiceless themselves. And so we're addicted almost to stepping in and standing in their place, rather than taking time out to listen to what they are saying, support them, and find a platform in order for them to be able to communicate that into the structures, into society, into the world at large. And I think those two addictions in some ways kind of hamper our responses to the issues of poverty around us. And it's not to say at all that there isn't good within both of those things, and there aren't times where we do need to speak, or there aren't times where we do need to give food. But I think our addiction to kind of solving the issue rather than necessarily kind of moving with the issue and opening up as a space where we might be transformed. A guy called John Sobrino once wrote a book which said, which was entitled "No Salvation Outside of the Poor." And the poor is not a phrase I actually really like, because it seems to be quite reducing and demeaning of people. And you probably notice I always talk about people who struggle with poverty, because that's just one aspect of their life. But from Sabrina, I took this idea that actually it is not those, or it's not that we come to be salvation for those who struggle against poverty. It's that they are salvation for us. And I think that in some ways might begin to undermine our addiction to being in the position of power and saying, we can sort your issues out. Within the tradition, there is this way of recognizing that actually as we encounter people who struggle against poverty, we encounter God, and that they save us through that process. So I think recovering from those two addictions is crucial if we are going to see the society emerge that we want to see emerge.
Thank you, Andrew. So I guess I would identify the first one as a temptation to want to be the provider and the one who kind of solves and fixes it. And the second one is actually a reluctance to shut up, to step back, and to empower others to speak for themselves. That those are both temptations. Fantastic. Okay, well let's hear maybe a response from Delene to what you've heard from Lynne and Andrew on this.
Thank you, Alistair. Yes, thank you, Bishop Lynne, and thank you, Andrew. I think, both of you have mentioned critical points that we deal with every day when we're dealing with issues of poverty and inequality. But I would just like to add that maybe that the main legacy goes back a little bit earlier than colonialism, and it's our attitude towards the poor. And Jesus questioned his disciples when they challenged Mary Magdalene when she anointed his body with expensive perfume, and I think he challenges, and we need to challenge ourselves every day. What is our attitude to the poor, and who are the poor? The early followers of Jesus would have probably been the marginalized and those outcasts and people who we would have considered poor. And how did we eventually get to the stage where we, as a church, are a huge institution we have acquired quite a lot of wealth. We've perpetrated many injustices along the way, and now we're trying to redress by dealing with the poor. Are the poor in our pews? Where do we find the poor? Do we go looking for them, or are they part of our congregations? And I think what we need to also question is that if we're dealing with poverty, we need to understand, what does our church membership look like, and how do they understand what the who the poor are, and then also what kind of agency do we create for people who are challenged with poverty to be able to make decisions alongside the church on dealing with issues of poverty, inequality, and injustice. And I think, yes, Andrew, you spoke all about the voice of the voiceless. Can we be that arrogant to say that we want to be the voice of the voiceless? Or should we be humbled enough to liberate ourselves to create platforms that allow people to speak for themselves? Thank you, Alistair.
Thanks, Delene. And so I'm hearing there a real challenge for the church to develop some greater humility in how we engage with people who are struggling with poverty. Philip.
Yeah, that's a very strong point Delene makes, because often people are keen to be voice for the voiceless. as long as the voiceless agree with them in the first place. I want to make a sort of positive and negative point in a minute, but first a quick rah for what Lynne said. Our nation, I think, is infected with institutions who exist primarily to ensure that existing structures of power and privilege are retained. I'm thinking particularly about the public schools and the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, all of which have a strongly negative impact on our common life, because they ensure that it's very difficult for those in poorer backgrounds to break into senior positions. Mary, when Jesus is conceived, sings Magnificat. She sings of a world turned on its head, a world in which the mighty are cast down, the humble are raised high. That should be the church's life. That should be what we're doing, where we're located. But of course, we kowtow all the time to these institutions. So we select clergy as if they were army officers. We form them in places that feel like public schools. We're in hock to the top universities and the way we train people, so that working class candidates so often feel second rate because they're not used to those institutions. So I think that's a real problem that we face. In terms of legacy more generally, an advantage, I think, is just the spread of the church, what in Anglican terms are called the cure of souls. So we aim to be in every community. Now, I think that I'll come back to how I think that's being weakened at the moment, but there is a desire to have a responsibility for every single human being in the country, rich or poor alike. And that historic responsibility, I think, means that churches are very often open to the cry of the vulnerable and the needy, and also very quick to respond. And I think we saw in lockdown how incredibly agile local churches were in responding to need, in a way that left local authorities and professionals absolutely gobsmacked that we could very quickly mobilize people, finance, buildings, and do stuff in local communities. And I think we very often play down the impact we have in terms of presence and in terms of volunteer networks, and thus our ability to act and act quickly. It's a powerful, powerful tool that we have in our bag. I think a negative a part of our legacy, though, is around inequality. So, if I think in Anglican terms for a moment, the inequality in terms of inherited wealth between dioceses is an absolute public scandal. If you divide inherited wealth in the Diocese of Lincoln by head of population, you get to the figure of £96. If you do the same thing in the Diocese of Liverpool, you get to the figure of 69 pence. So there is far more resource in wealthier areas than in poor areas. And that resource translates into bodies on the ground. So if you compare clergy deployment in Cambridge to that in Blackpool, the comparison is an eye-watering one. So structural inequalities between dioceses, and that's quickly translated into structural inequalities between churches. So if you live in a wealthy area, you've probably got a lovely, warm, beautifully carpeted, well-maintained church with a lovely church hall, which is well-resourced, perhaps with an administrator, a youth worker, everything going fine. Those people who live in our poorer areas, often struggling buildings, clergy very, very overstretched. There's just this radical inequality, which then impacts on what we can invest in mission. And we're very quick to condemn inequality when we see it elsewhere in the country, but very slow to address it within our own structures. And that's a disaster, because every single renewal movement in the church's history has come from areas characterized by poverty, from the marginal areas. And if we're not present strongly there, then we can never recapture imaginations of the gospel.
Thank you, Philip. And that is, I think, quite a striking thing, is the kind of inequality. We're thinking, I think, particularly here with the Church of England, within the Church of England, between different areas, which somewhat reflects the inequalities in wider society, but it can accentuate it as well. Okay, well, let's then turn to our second question. As we've already noted, amidst the economic challenges of the present, those who are poorest are typically being the worst affected. And many local churches, as Philip just mentioned, have responded in positive and creative ways to this situation, particularly during the course of the pandemic. Some of these responses have come out of a traditional model of providing for people, and Andrew's noted how that's potentially quite problematic because it risks colluding with the unjust structures. Others have been more collaborative and empowering, working with those whom a local church is seeking to serve in partnership with people in the local community and with local groups. So our second question, which we've already had some hints of ways some of you are thinking about, but how does the church need to change in order to seriously address poverty and injustice? And might there be any examples that can inspire us on this? Philip, let's start with you on this one.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Yeah, I'd say in terms of the church changing in order to address these issues better, I'd pick out 3 areas, I think. The first is presence. You know, we're very good at saying what the church should be doing here and there and everywhere, but let's just be honest, over the last 30 or 40 years, we've been slowly withdrawing from areas characterised by deprivation. We've been closing and merging churches. We've been withdrawing clergy. We reckon there's at least 500 large estates with no Christian presence whatsoever. The financial pressures churches are under post-pandemic will no doubt accelerate that speed of withdrawal. And that's catastrophic. You know, it's catastrophic in every sense. You know, the Church of England is wanting to address issues of racial justice, and yet our presence is weaker and weaker in the areas where the majority of global majority heritage people live. We want to talk about a bias to the poor, but at the same time withdrawing exactly those churches. So we need to be, in that area, we need a really massive programme of church planting back into estates and areas characterised by poverty. We need to see a massive shift of resource so that we're really investing in those most deprived communities. And also we need to be more confident about where service and proclamation come together in imaginative and proper ways. Often we're very good at serving, we're very slow to proclaim him in whose name we serve. Often those engaged in community ministry are very, very nervous of evangelism. And in the words of Pope Francis, the worst form of deprivation is to be deprived of ever hearing the news, saving news of Jesus Christ. So something very big about presence in terms of our own structures. And there's a second call, we've hinted on this, and about leadership. We need to be much, much better at calling, discerning, forming leaders from working class backgrounds. That is an overwhelmingly important area. We can't hope to have proper Christian presence in estates and inner city areas if we're simply constantly having to pour in leaders from other places and middle class leaders. It just doesn't work. It's doing church for people rather than with people. And what's depressing is, I was reading David Shepherd's biography recently, is how far backwards we've gone on this. We've actually taken backward steps in terms of forming and calling working class leaders. There's some, fragile experiments going on in different parts of the country at the moment. We've got something called Empower course in this diocese, for example, but the track record is weak, and I don't see any joined up or coherent approach to the leadership issue. And the third, really, I'll dwell on much shorter, because it's Andrew's raised this point in many ways. It's about going beyond the service provider model. In some ways, when I ask parishes what they're doing about meeting need, about reaching out into their communities, often the food bank is the beginning and the end of the answer. And for me, that's a depressing answer, because it's service provider and often it's non-relational. So we need to be thinking how we meet needs at a time of crisis in ways that build relationships, in ways that really empower, in ways that enable users to become volunteers, to become leaders, in ways that work actually for justice. And we need to shake off our nervousness of speaking into the political sphere and actually going upstream and engaging with the issues. There's nothing new about this cost of living crisis. It's the culmination of issues we've been ignoring as a nation for ages, particularly around a culture of low pay and around the left behind communities. We knew it was happening. We don't have the nerve to speak into the political as Christians, and we have to recover our voice there. So 3 areas for me: presence, leadership, and going beyond the service provider model.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Philip. Delene, let's hear from you next, and particularly interested in whether you've got any different take coming out of your African context. How does the church need to change?
Thank you, Alistair. Well, the church I belong to is the Anglican Church, so it's very similar to yours. And I think what's important for us to address is we need to make sure that we are serious about mission and ministry. And quite often we have it as one of our 5 objectives. Then we have outreach and social justice, or it's our 3rd point of mission. And I think what we need to do is we need to be able to challenge the whole church, so the entire congregation. It needs to be the work of everybody, every baptized member of our church, and not just the social justice committee or the charity committee. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we have institutionalized poverty and created it, to be its own institution within the church. So it's another add-on that we do alongside the women's ministry and the youth ministry. Then there's the social outreach. So maybe that's what we need to be looking at differently. A theologian who, the late Steve de Gruchy, once said at a conference, the problem of poverty is wealth. He was quite unpopular. We had lots of Europeans and Americans at this conference who were quite uncomfortable. But I think that's the job of the church, is to ask these uncomfortable questions. How do we redistribute wealth and transfer resources that are needed in communities? How do we ensure that we invest better, not just the church, but governments and businesses invest in creating infrastructure that will improve the lives of people in communities where there isn't sufficient. And in our situation, we would want to just look at the education. I mean, just like you, we have public education and we have private education. But within our public or government education, there are levels of inequality. So that how does the church actually call on the government to make sure it equitably distributes the resources so that all children have a relatively good education? Because we know, that probably is the foundation to being able to improve people's life conditions, and to be able to move out of poverty. So I think, for the church, what needs to change is we need to probably stop doing the same things that we've been doing for the last couple of hundreds of years. And the food banks and the soup kitchens are needed, but that's not, we need to go a little bit beyond that and understand what are the structures and the systems that keep people in poverty and locked into generational poverty, and how do we break those cycles? And I think that we also need to understand that the church can't do this alone. So we need to have partnerships, and probably partnerships with people that we don't want to be partners with, but those are partnerships that we need to have so that we challenge others to do better. And then we need to ask ourselves and paint the scenario: what happens if the church doesn't do poverty eradication work? What if the governments don't create social security? What kind of world, what will happen to the world? Will we implode? Or will, or will the rich be able to carry on? And so it's addressing systemic poverty. That's the role of the church. We need to ask uncomfortable questions. And then, of course, we also need, as a church, what we have spoken about this already, we need to be able to engage with people. And we need to be able to learn the tools of engaging as equals, so that we can listen to what are the dreams and aspirations of people who we consider poor, and not base our outreach work on what our needs are, because we need to give. And so it feels good to have a food bank, but are we meeting the needs of the people in terms of what they actually need? Are we consistent also? We have a soup kitchen when Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but then Friday is not good because we've got a prayer group. So are we being consistent? Are we being holistic? Are we actually listening to the poor and listening to the people? And then, of course, are we willing to engage with communities, with businesses, with other churches in designing solutions to move communities out of poverty, designing solutions to deal with the challenges, like solutions to deal with issues of gender-based violence, of alcohol and drug abuse, of teenage pregnancy, and things that are actually symptoms of poverty. But as we design solutions to deal with those, we are also enabling people to better move forward in life and choose options and have a better range of options to choose from. one of the models that we use, we try to use in Southern Africa, is an asset-based community development model, where we look at working with what people have and beginning there and looking at their agency, instead of using a needs-based approach, where we assume that they need computers and they need the internet and they need books, but look at what is it that the community has that we can build on. Thank you, Alistair.
Great, thank you very much, Delene. I think that we had a number of striking things in what you shared, one being about how actually a concern for justice and inequality needs to be integral to our Christian discipleship, not an optional kind of add-on, but that the church needs to be part of addressing things in asking those bigger questions about why people are ending up in poverty and what needs to change and how can we be part of that change to affect something that can really be life-giving. Yeah, Andrew or Lynne, either of you like to respond to what you've heard? Go on, Andrew.
Yeah, really helpful. Lots of what I've just heard, and kind of it just got me thinking when Philip was talking about presence, and actually Delene talking about listening. I think we need to be a listening presence. And by that, that's listening to local people, listening to the structures and people around it. But it's also about listening to the Spirit. 16 years ago, we moved up to Leeds. We moved into what I would say was described as a low-income neighbourhood on the east side of Leeds. There was a bunch of us, just a small Christian group of people who were under the umbrella of the Salvation Army, moved into that neighbourhood. And we said, we'll spend the first year listening. We hadn't got a building or anything like kind of stuff. And to be honest, it was that we'd moved up from southwest London. So if we'd have turned up with, this is what you need to do, we'd have got a very short answer, probably two-word answer. The second word would have probably been off. So we knew that we had to listen to that context and to listen to those people. And it was a remarkable experience for the 10 years that we lived there. But I remember one of the first things that we got involved in was a local event. It was a kind of party in the park kind of thing. And we said we'd volunteer, and our job was to slap appropriately first, second, and third stickers on the kids as they did their kids races. And so we were at the end, watching these very competitive young people running in our direction with their competitive family members, some of whose fathers had very much thicker necks than ours, watching to make sure that we'd done it right. And we went through the whole thing doing this thing. And halfway through the afternoon, the lady that was running the session, local lady, no Christian background at all, said to us, we've got some prizes. And it wasn't Sunday school Haribo sweet prizes. It was proper prizes, you know, assigned football by the Leeds United football team, worthless to many of us. But, you know, these were proper things that they got. And she said, we're going to sit people down at the end, the kids down, and we're going to look at, we'll give out the big prizes first. And we'll give the big prizes to the kids who don't have any first, second, or third stickers. And before I knew it, the words toppled out of my mouth. That's really interesting, Maureen. Jesus said something about that. She said, oh, really? And then we carried on and we talked about it at the end. But do you see what I mean? The Spirit is already at work in this place, putting things into the order of creation, the intended order. And it's sometimes presence means listening long enough so that we might be able to articulate and frame that which is good that is already being going on around the Christian narrative. And so I think that kind of listening presence is fundamental. And that leads to a wide range of things. Well, we can get beyond service providers. A lady called Mary, who's just a remarkable kind of caretaker for the neighbourhood. When anybody has a problem, they go to Mary. She came to us and she said, look, people are really struggling for food. Why don't, it'd be great to be able to do a meal once a week, you know, just to eat with them, not as a soup kitchen, but just everybody together eating. And she said, but we don't have a venue. Can you go and talk to the Anglican church? I don't know why she thought I could talk to the Anglican church as a total nonconformist, but she figured I could. So I went and talked to the Anglican church, and we got this room in the back of their church. I forgot to ask if they got a kitchen, which was a bit of a problem. So we had these camping stoves that we used to bring in, and people cooked together. And then they started a garden project, and they ended up on Gardener's Question Time because of the way that the gardening thing grew. And all we did was have hospitality with one another. That's what where sometimes we felt like guests and sometimes we felt like hosts. And actually that issue of people needing to eat wasn't turned into here's your bag of stuff. It was, okay, how can we be community together? And that came from the community, and that kind of listening presence then enabled that. I really like some of what was said around leadership. And just recollecting that, you know, years ago, the low-income neighbourhoods that we're talking about produced leaders. It had the infrastructure, whether that was the trade unions, whether it was the chapels, or whether it was a working men's club. It had the infrastructure to produce leaders. Therefore, your MP was local because they'd learned how to lead in that context. And we have to find ways of harnessing the leadership that is there, that will not look like we think leadership looks. And we have to learn from the difference of that kind of leadership style, recognizing the behavior will be different, the model will be different, and but we learn from the leadership, we enhance the leadership because it exists. If only we can wait long enough. The last thing that I'd want to say as well is kind of picking up on Delane's points around redistribution. We have to fall in love with the Bible as an imagination factory again. When you read Leviticus, when you read Deuteronomy, and they're banging on about the Sabbath year, and they're banging on about the Jubilee year, we have to ask the question, how can this be inhabited? How can this be lived in our context? And enable the imagination factory that the Bible is to really inform what's going on. So we listen to the Bible, we listen to the Spirit, and we listen to the neighbourhood and see where that takes us as we seek to engage with people.
That's very exciting, Andrew. And I really like your thing about listening presence. For me, that ties in with something we were talking about earlier about humility and about not thinking that we as the church have necessarily got the answers, but that it takes that humility to really be prepared to listen. Lynne, what response do you want to offer to what you've heard from Philip and Delene?
I thought there was a lot that was rich in what Philip and Delene said, and also in Andrew's response, so thank you for those. With regard to leadership, a good news story from the Church of England is we've revised the selection criteria, now called selection qualities, for ordained leadership, and it means now that a much broader range of people can evidence against those. There have been all kinds of tweaks. When I went through the discernment process, I was a single mum, and I had nobody to look after my kids, and the fact that you had to stay residentially for part of the discernment process was a real issue. So we're really pleased now that you can actually do that process non-residentially. So it's all things like that, all the barriers. When people say, you know, people don't want to be involved or they don't engage, we need to look harder at what barriers we're putting in people's way, because there are always barriers there. There are always barriers there, and it's looking at what those are and removing them so far as we can. Both Delene and Philip mentioned addressing systemic poverty. I really like the point about, you know, it's not, poverty isn't there for whoever's the corporate social responsibility person or even heads up the food bank. It's a responsibility of us all. When I was at the Lambeth conference, I was speaking to some bishops from the Philippines, and they said to me, you know, how do the 5 marks of mission play out in the Church of England? So I started blathering on about, you know, we nurture new believers and we preach in the gospel and all that kind of stuff that you would expect an Anglican bishop to say. And then I said to them, you know, how's it in the Filipino church? And he said, we speak for those who are suffering. And I don't think we speak enough in the church for those who are suffering, that millions in this country have been deliberately managed down into destitution over the last decade. You know, food banks are not normal. You know, that is a government policy. You have Rishi Sunak caught on camera saying, we have taken funding out of deprived urban areas. We mustn't be afraid to say this stuff. That is our role. Our role is to speak for those who are suffering. So I think that's one thing that I would like to see. Philip does a great job, but we do need the church to speak out on issues of poverty and injustice. And the other thing about resource in the church is some dioceses we're given funding for our poorer areas. Not all dioceses use them in the poorer areas. Funding for poorer areas should be absolutely ring-fenced for those areas. It's the concept of additionality. They need additional funding, and that should be over and above any funding that the diocese gives already. So that's the other thing that I picked up from what Philip said.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Well, I think there's an enormous amount there to give people a chance to have a conversation now in small groups. So those of you who've been listening on the call, thank you for your engagement and commitment so far. What we want to do is give you a chance just to sort of process some of what you've heard in conversation with 2 or 3 others who are on the call. So 2 simple questions for you. What's resonated with what you've heard? What would you want to add or affirm in some way? So Debbie's posted those into the chat.
Recorded.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope that's been useful as a way to process some of what you've heard, and will help to keep you engaged for the sort of final part of this conversation. Although, if like me, you've been kind of loving it, I'm hoping that there's no problem about keeping you engaged for where we're going with our last part. So we're going to turn to our third question. My sense is, and this has been referred to already a bit, that within the UK at least, issues around poverty linked to issues around class, and Lynne started with that as a sort of key point. And many of us in the church, or is it just within the Church of England? I know, Andrew, you might have something to say for that, coming from a nonconformist tradition, are from relatively middle or upper class backgrounds. This is especially the case for those in leadership roles, and we've had a number of comments noting that as well. In the last couple of years in the church, certainly within the Church of England, the church has done a better job of seeking to address issues of racial inequality and injustice. However, I've not sensed a similar willingness to engage in a conversation about class or how the culture of our churches might need to shift to be more genuinely inclusive of people from across the social spectrum. So let's give it a chance for any of our speakers to respond to this. How does this look from where you're located? What might be needed to affect a positive shift within the church? Who wants to pick that up? Lynne, do you want to kick off on that?
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. The good news is that it is changing, certainly from the Church of England's perspective. So there's a piece of research that's just being commissioned around the well-being of working class clergy. That's the first time in a central Church of England document I've ever seen the term working class. So in things that I've been involved in the past, I've asked for the term working class to be included, and it's what I've been told is we have to put socioeconomic background from different. So it's the first step. So we are getting there. We are naming it, and I think that's part of the way to solving and certainly making the culture a little bit more balanced. What I would say is we each have agency in this. So if you're asked to amend your accent, or if you're asked, or if people mimic your accent, I get that all the time, even in the role I'm in now, people mimicking my accent. You know, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to do that. So whatever agency you have within the role that you have, don't accept that you have to be assimilated into church structures that are not just. We each need to use our agency in those and continue to challenge. I was invited to a thing at the Bishop's House some years ago, and the mixer event was croquet. Now, you know, that we didn't have a huge number of croquet lawns when I was a kid. So it's just looking at what's going on around us, and we will change the church by constantly refusing to accept a church that doesn't look just. And that would be my response to that.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Yeah, I mean, that's, I'm almost gobsmacked to think that anyone thought that croquet could be an appropriate way to kind of break the ice between people, but there we go. Hopefully, as you say, things are beginning to change. There are some signs of that. Who would like to pick up the baton next?
I'm happy to go next.
Go on, Philip.
I mean, there seems to me to be a fundamental question about what questions the church is answering. You know, the mission is all about listening to questions and engaging with questions, the questions of the culture or a group of people throws up. And we seem to me, in terms of engaging with working class communities, to be answering the wrong questions. We're allowing our questions to be set for us by the academy, or perhaps by the progressive left, or by the media, not by working class communities. And that's often because perhaps at times we don't know the answer, or we don't want to listen to what's being said. And Maurice Glassman, I think, is a very, very interesting person in this area, not without controversy. But he would say that, you know, to really engage working class communities, we need to be looking very closely at three questions about family, about place, and about work. And those three areas, family, place, work, are traditionally areas that the Church of England has had a great deal to say, where we've very, very much lost our voice. Family, which sort of engages, you know, that's the preoccupying thing for so many people. We're nervous of talking about the family because of other agendas. Place, you know, we saw the power of nationhood yesterday with the entire country sitting down to watch a royal funeral. And yet we're very, very nervous of language around nationhood or patriotism or whatever, you know, for all sorts of strong reasons. But it does mean we've lost a certain, and also people's engagement with their own community, with the needs of their place where they live. And of course, how weak we are at speaking into the workplace and addressing issues around work and around workplace justice. So very often we're just simply, our language, our dialogue, the questions we're answering is just failing to engage with working class communities. And for me, the big sign of that was Brexit, where, you know, we've got a largely Remain leadership seeking to minister to a largely Brexit, or, you know, the analysis of somewheres and anywheres is an interesting one there. But it did show a Church of England, you know, the strength of the Church of England condemnation of that vote, and the absolute indignation of many in leadership, for me, demonstrated a Church of England that's deeply out of touch with the needs and aspirations, and the misunderstanding of that vote actually is sort of deep out of touchness with many working class communities.
Thank you, Philip. Andrew, I saw you kind of nodding vigorously there. Do you want to kind of pick up the baton?
Yeah, I'll pick up the baton in a bunch of different ways. I think we have to be careful with terms like working class, not because I don't think there isn't such a thing, but I think it's a much more nuanced category than we often give credit. And so, you know, I mean, just even things like yesterday, in some working class communities, actually, they wouldn't be sat in front of the television because it would be a reaction against the establishment. And so there's a kind of, there's a nuance. Being working class in an estate in Leeds is very different to being working class in a kind of east side of London or whatever. And I think we just need to always nuance this really well and carefully, that we don't just categorize people all in one lump. I think for me, I think what Philip said about the Brexit, it was fascinating. On my wife, her Facebook page, it was the difference in context was amazing. Lots of her local friends were very much, we're going to leave, we want to leave, lots of our friends from Southwest London, where we were before, where we're going to stay and we need to stay. And there's a sense of, and one of my readings of that was something we observed in our neighbourhood, which is the sense of loss that was very deep for people. Loss of industry, loss of commerce within their neighbourhood. You know, we live in one of those classic back-to-back neighbourhoods where every end of the back-to-backs used to be a shop and they'd all gone, and there's a kind of continual loss. And I think Maurice Glassman was right. I changed the word work to contribution, though. I think for me, there was a sense that for many I'm talking particularly northern working class neighbourhoods, where everybody was involved in a particular industry. You know, Hunslet, we built the trains that went around the world. We dug, and there was a sense that was not just a job that they did, it was a contribution that they was making to society. And I think unless we, particularly for many white working class men, unless we find ways in which we can enable contribution to be made for a bigger picture, for a bigger whole, for a bigger good, then we're always going to really struggle. I think the last thing I'd want to say is one of the issues that we really need to work hard at is language, how we describe things, and being careful that in the language that we choose, we don't double stigmatise people and communities that are already stigmatised. And so just we're doing that hard yards on what is the right way to talk about people, and the only way of doing that is including them in how we talk and enabling them to talk. That will enable us not to have a kind of negative effect that we're not wanting, but our language betrays a particular sociological position that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. That suggests that, you know, actually dialogue and conversation and hearing, okay, so how do you think about yourself? How do you name yourself is really critical for that.
Can I say, Alistair, on that? Yeah. Studies vary, but between 47% and 60% of this country identify as working class. And what we've got to be very careful of is that we don't get so picky about the language that we use that we lose sight of the issue. So in the church, for instance, when I started talking about class 10 years ago, I was told there's no such thing as a class system anymore. What are you talking about? There are several studies that you've probably seen on class, and most working class academics agree that to use the word working class is very important, because actually it's however you self-identify within that, and it's a moot point because there's quite a lot of professional and managerial people identify as working class. So the concept has changed, but I think the point remains, and I think it sounds like we all feel much the same on this, that the church fails to listen to people, fails to listen to how people identify themselves. And I think the fact that people self-identify as working class, for me, is quite powerful, really.
Great, thank you.
I was more thinking about language of calling people poor, and that kind of language that I think actually is problematic.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Delene, I want to make sure to come to you, and I'm guessing that maybe class issues might play out differently in your African context, but maybe partly because of the colonial legacy, there's a lot of similarities. What's your take?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Alistair. Yes, of course, you know, it is a little bit different when we talk about class. Obviously, class, it depends on what class you find yourself in. It does allow for you to, I mean, it creates unequal opportunities. And I think the whole question about class, especially in the church, is that we have a particular culture. I mean, in our church, it is considered to be you speak English. We live in South Africa is a country, we have 11 official languages, but when we have a provincial synod, majority Black clergy and lay people, everything is done in English. So it's okay for you to be part of the decision making of the church, but then you need to speak English properly. And you need to be able to write English properly if you want to pass a resolution at a synod. So I think, class has a way of excluding people. And Bishop Lynne is right, if you have the right accent, you get access. And people listen to you and think you're a bit cleverer if you speak with certain language that you use. And then I think also in the church, we need to, when we plan our outreach and our mission work, we must be clear, what are we expecting to see people achieve? What is it that we want to see? When do we think they would have arrived? If they have a computer at home, if they drive a car, if they have a driver's license, do they own? So what are we must also be careful because we don't want people to think that they failed if they don't achieve the standards that we want them to achieve, so that they would have arrived to where we want them to arrive. Let me stop there.
Okay, well, is there a thread that we haven't yet picked up on this that any of you would like to kind of tease out a bit further, or to pick up on something that's come through the first part of the conversation? And if any of you who are listening in want to add a particular question you'd welcome hearing as a response from our speakers, do add something into the chat as well, and we'll try and keep an eye on that. Go on, Lynne.
Some questions.
Sorry, carry on.
Go on, Lynne. No, go on.
I was just going to say, I think I've been talking to the national church about how we communicate as the Church of England. So we broadcast on BBC Radio quite a lot, BBC Radio 4. I come from a working class community. Nobody listened to Radio 4 there. So why are we not putting stuff out on commercial radio? So the viewing figures of Radio 4 are about 10, 11 million a week. The viewing figures for for Smooth and Heart FM are about 16 million. So where God is so abundant, he sows seed on stony ground. We're not even sowing on all the fertile ground. So we need to look at where we're communicating and how, because I think that we're not targeting whole swathes of the country and whole communities. And I think that's a terrible shame.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, I mean, are there other churches other than the Church of England who are doing a better job at that, and actually offering lessons for us to learn from?
I don't think so. I mean, Philip, I don't know.
I'd love to know about the Pentecostalist church in your area, Lynne, in particular, which seems to have quite a strong presence in many estates and urban areas.
Yeah, we have got a lot of free churches that are really, really vibrant here. But I have to say, I was saying this before the webinar started, the Church of England churches here are just buoyant. I mean, just, we've got people who are having to put on more than one service because we've got so many people coming along on a Sunday and so fully engaged. So yeah, I think we can all do better, to be honest, in terms of communication. If we don't put out communication as church, all they hear is when something lurid hits the headlines, and then it's in the news. So we need to be putting out the vast majority of the stuff that the church does is absolutely positive good news for the poor. We need to be putting more of that out and showing the impact that we have and the contribution that we make to local economies. Absolutely phenomenal stuff that we're doing as churches across denominations.
So I'm wondering about the connection here with the kind of deeper listening work that is needed, what does some of that deeper listening work look like, and what are some ways into that? Whilst folks were in the breakout rooms, we were talking a bit about some of the value of an asset-based community development understanding, as well as some limitations of that. Andrew, I'm wondering whether you might pick that up a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know if people are aware of asset-based community development. In many respects, it's the opposite of starting with what's the problems around here. It asks the question, what's good around here? What might we build, and what might this offer? And I think that's I think that's definitely a better starting point for engaging in communities, without a shadow of a doubt. But my reading of it, if you don't also address the fact that the place has deficits, that you know, there might be at the neighbourhood we lived in, 10 pubs close in 7 years, leaving one pub, which some people might celebrate, but actually there's no places for people to gather, to be together. So there's a kind of sense of that's a deficit, unless we recognise that there is both assets and deficits. My concern with some of the language around ABCD, whilst recognising some of the impulse that is good, but my concern is that actually it is kind of very much economic language, and I would prefer to kind of have more of a kind of the language of gifts and wounds. So what's gift in this place? What is some of the things that this place can contribute, not just to its neighbourhood, but to society as a whole? How could the neighbourhood that we lived in actually be a gift to the wider Leeds, whilst also recognising that there are many wounds within that place? On every Good Friday, we walked around the places of loss in our neighbourhood. Because they were wounds, and that the loss might be factories that were closed, they might be pubs that were closed, they might be places where people had ended their own lives that people knew about, etc., etc. And we went and prayed liturgies of loss, which kind of in some ways drew that into the Christian narrative. And for me, it's the sense of actually not just what the place has as gifts and wounds, but what does the church has that's gift and wounds, and a kind of fidelity about that, rather than kind of either saying that, you know, we come with all the answers, but we also come with our brokenness. I
think I'd want to counter. Yeah, I want to counter that. I think really, because a lot of my experience is working with churches in post-industrial areas, where there's locked into both the church and the estate a deep sense of scarcity. You know, they're very, very powerfully aware of what they haven't got, the leaders they lack, the people they lack, the young generations they lack, and very deeply aware, almost by default, of the woundedness of their communities and the problems their communities have faced. So that is the starting point. And I don't really, I've always avoided leading a church that then confronts people all the more with scarcity and woundedness. What I want to do is change the language with language of hope. And that's where an asset-based or gift-based, whatever you call it, with that approach is very, very positive indeed. You're almost taking as read people's understanding of the pain of a community. And they're saying, what has God given us in this place? Look at this beautiful gift God has given us in you. Look at this gift God has given us in, you know, our schools or our community centres or our buildings or whatever. And trying to change the language from that of lament to that of joy, from that of... Sorry, were you trying to come in there, Alistair?
Well, and my sense is the connection with what I heard Andrew saying is that there's something about valuing people's humanity that is really vital there. And you know, and part of what I hear you point to, Philip, is you know, actually celebrating the gifts of people's humanity really has to be at the heart of what the church can contribute in engaging with a community that is facing significant challenges around sort of economic challenges. So I mean that would be my sense of at least the connection between the two of you. But maybe I'm kind of yeah, trying to smooth it over in a way that it doesn't need to be smoothed over. Lynne,
I think it's not an either or. I think it's a both and. I think, you know, and in some ways, the narrative, right, central within the Christian faith is a both and. It's the woundedness of the cross and it's the hope of the resurrection. It's the gift of the resurrection. And I kind of, I would never start there. I think you always need to start. Well, you start by listening, but you can't kind of not take note of that which is said. There is more woundedness. You can't just kind of say, oh no, that doesn't exist. Let's just look at the good things. We have to see it. I think possibly, Philip, we're almost saying the same thing, because you have to see it transformed, but there has to be meaningful transformation as we work through it together.
Yeah, Delene.
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, Andrew and Philip, I think what we need to move towards an understanding that it's a complex system that we're working in, and the system also evolves all the time. And many of these methodologies or academic writings tend to be a little bit binary. So, you know, you focus on the assets and not the needs, and we should probably hold both of them together to say, how do we use the best of both to address you know, the challenges of the community. Yes, people need hope and motivation, but there's also a sense of reality that we need to look at, and if we can't heal the wounds that people and heal memories, and we won't be able to use the gifts that we have to move forward.
Yeah, my sense is that seems really important, Delene, that there needs to be an honesty, and I think that's what I hear you saying, Andrew. There needs to be an honesty about the challenges that are being faced, but we can't just get stuck on that. There has to be something about actually the life that is present within the community, within individuals within the community, and the gifts that we are offered through what God has given us. That can be celebrated, can be drawn on, can be built on in different ways, and can be drawn together to work for the common good. That you know, it has to, as you say, Andrew, it has to be a both and, is my sense. Lynne, you've been quiet for a bit. Just want to check whether there's anything there you wanted to respond on or pick up on.
No, I have to say I have sympathy with Andrew's view about asset-based community development. I come from a background in community engagement and development, and it always concerned me that it could look quite trite when you go into communities that are facing considerable challenges. I think it has got merit in terms of an approach, but I think you can sort of be interpreted sometimes as saying, you know, you're on 0 hours contracts, you know, your housing is substandard, all of these things, but here's a lovely community garden that you've got, you know, so it can kind of minimize some very real issues. And I think it has to go really hand in hand with some strong sense of social justice and helping people to take a platform on some of the, you know, the bigger macro issues, really. But I think it's a very good approach, ABCD. I've not got much more to add, really, other than I would just stress, I think we all have agency in this. I think we all have if we're members of church, whether we're in leadership, whether, picking up Delene's point, whether we're sitting in the congregation, we all have agency to empower those around us and to lift up the poor in that kind of Magnificat sense. So I think it's take the agency you have, don't accept things as they are, challenge the status quo, and do what the church is there to do, which is to fill the hungry with good things and send the rich away empty.
And I think part of the challenge I'm hearing you and others sharing with us, Lynne, is that if we don't look at some of the bigger structural issues that are contributing to the inequality and help the church to engage with that and to bring some challenge to the politicians who've been elected, and to those who have got the capacity to affect some of those structural changes, then we're really missing out in terms of what the church is called to, and we're falling short of what God's looking for from us. That's my sense of it from what I'm hearing from you. Philip, did you want to respond back to what you've heard there?
I mean, all I want to say is do something. I mean, I think the problem is when you attend a webinar, you can hear so many people theorizing and criticizing this model or that model that you end up feeling a bit, you know, what do I actually do about all this? And I think the point is, you know, Christians are called to action. And I think every Christian needs to think, how can I be good news? Every church needs to think, how can I be good news to the poor? And think how that can be translated into some form of action, be that prayer or generosity or listening or engaging with the communities we're not part of. You know, I think one thing we need to see is modeling larger churches, how they can plant and start new congregations in those areas we've left behind, for example. So I think thinking, how does desire turn into action is a very important thing to do.
Yes, and I don't hear anybody going to disagree with you on that. And it seems that really at the heart of part of what we've been exploring is how do we discern what's appropriate action? How do we listen and act with others rather than just you know, think, oh well, I'll do this because that's clearly going to be a good
absolutely thing. With, not for, and how you do with in a way that's forming leaders and empowering people. That's the key thing. Being a brilliant story, Fleetwood in Lancashire, which is a town with extraordinary pressures around widespread social deprivation. And they started, you know, old-fashioned service provider model. Let's put on a lunch for these people. These people, note my language. But what started with that very quickly became profoundly relational. And, you know, these people quickly became friends, and then they became volunteers, and then some started to lead. And someone who started as a user of that service is now running it. Others have become servers of the Mass on a Sunday. And that was a parish that just did something because it saw a need and learned an approach which was much more about empowerment and increasingly much more about justice.
And I think I've heard so many stories similar to that, Philip, which really give one hope that actually, providing we keep listening, keep attentive, that there really is relational, that actually what can be built is something that can genuinely be life-giving and good news across the whole. Well, I think that's a great note to be drawing towards a close. So a huge thank you to the four of you for joining us, to Andrew Grinnell, Delene Mark, Lynne Cullens and Philip North. Our next webinar is the final one of 2022, which will be on the 1st of November and is entitled Reconciling Arts. I'm going to be joined by four speakers with an interest in the arts for that. Jackie Cresswell, who's the Visual Arts Advisor to Salisbury Cathedral, Mary Gregory, who's the Canon for Arts and Reconciliation at Coventry Cathedral, Sarah Bourne, who's Chaplain for the Arts at St Mary's Banbury, and Winifred Omoaka, who's a multidisciplinary artist in London. So very much hope you might be able to join us for that on the 1st of November. Let's draw to a close. Lynne, would you be willing just to offer a closing prayer for us before we say goodbye to folks? You're on mute at the moment.
Silent prayer, yes. So let's pray, everybody. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for our time together this afternoon. Thank you for all the rich experiences and wisdom that have been shared. Thank you for the discussions that have been had in the breakout groups. Thank you that we are a people who are passionate about the cause of those who are disadvantaged, voiceless, and in financial hardship in this country. And as we approach a mini budget, towards the end of this week, and as we lift to you the escalating cost of living, we pray for all those in need, Father. We pray your Spirit will move through the government and the hearts will be softened. And we pray for our part as church leaders, as Christians, as members of congregations, that we may each use the power that we have and how you move our hearts to advocate for those who are facing such difficult times over this winter and into the future. And we pray all of that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you so much, everybody who's joined us on the call. Blessings on you for the rest of your afternoon. We will have a recording of this up on our website in due course if you'd like to revisit it, or if you'd like to recommend it to others who weren't able to be present for the call. So I look